What happens when a weapon built to break a 40-year promise finally gets tested against the mountain that promise was built on? For 4 decades, Iran believed that if you dig deep enough into solid rock, nothing above ground can ever touch you. On one night, that belief was put to the test, and the answer came back in fire. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now, not because I'm asking you to, but because in the next 25 minutes, you're going to understand this strike on a level almost nobody else covering it is explaining. Tap that like button too. It costs you nothing, but it tells this channel to keep digging into stories like this one instead of chasing empty headlines. Let's get into what actually happened. To understand why this strike matters so much, you have to go back further than the explosion itself. You have to go back to a decision Iran made a very long time ago, one that shaped almost everything about how this country fights, hides, and survives. Iran has never been able to compete with the United States or Israel in open sky combat. Its air force is old. Many of its fighter jets are decades behind, kept alive with spare parts smuggled in around sanctions that have choked the country for years. Its radar systems and air defenses have been upgraded here and there, but they have been punched through again and again by precision weapons in recent conflicts. Any honest military planner inside Iran knew this truth a long time ago. They could not win a fight in the air. So they made a different choice. If the sky belongs to your enemy, you take everything valuable and put it where the sky cannot reach. You go underground. That single decision quietly shaped Iran's entire defense strategy for the better part of 2 generations. Engineers, geologists, and military planners studied the country's mountain ranges the way a general studies a battlefield map. They were not looking for beauty. They were looking for density. Rock that could absorb an impact, terrain that could hide an entrance in plain sight. Somewhere near Isfahan, deep inside Iran's interior, one of these projects grew into something enormous. Picture it not as a single bunker, but as an entire hidden city built sideways into a mountain, tunnels stretching for miles, storage chambers packed with missiles, launch corridors positioned to send weapons out toward the surface on command, maintenance bays where technicians could work on hardware without ever stepping into daylight. Commercial satellite images taken over the last 20 years show this site slowly growing in careful, patient stages. New openings appear. Old ones get reinforced with fresh concrete. The ground around each entrance gets reshaped and replanted so it blends back into the natural slope of the mountain, almost like the site is trying to disappear into the landscape on purpose. Some intelligence reports go even further, suggesting Iran built fake tunnel entrances into the same mountain range. Empty shells with nothing behind them, built for one reason only, to trick an enemy into wasting an expensive weapon on solid rock instead of an actual missile depot. That is not the kind of plan you build in a rush during wartime. That is the kind of plan you build slowly, carefully across decades, based on one core belief. If you bury something deep enough, nothing built to destroy a building on the surface will ever be able to reach it. For a long time, that belief was correct. And here is something worth understanding. Iran did not invent this strategy from nothing. Burying critical military capability under mountains has a long history in other parts of the world too. North Korea has spent decades hollowing out entire mountain ranges to protect artillery, command centers, and pieces of its weapons program from anything short of the most powerful strikes imaginable. Hezbollah, on a much smaller scale in southern Lebanon, dug its own underground tunnel systems for very similar reasons. Cheap to build, hard to target, and psychologically reassuring for the fighters hiding beneath the surface. What made Iran's version different was not the basic idea, it was the scale, and it was how tightly everything was connected. Underground missile storage was tied directly into a much larger industrial supply chain, so that in theory, a missile could be built, stored, and eventually launched almost entirely without ever being exposed to outside eyes. Analysts who study these systems describe it as a quiet arms race that almost never makes headlines. One side keeps digging deeper, the other side keeps building weapons that can reach further down. For most of this century, the digging managed to stay just ahead of the drilling. This strike is one of the clearest signs yet that the balance in that quiet race has finally shifted, and shifted hard. The larger campaign behind this moment has come to be known as Operation Epic Fury, a sustained push by American forces to dismantle Iran's ability to build, store, and eventually fire its missile and drone arsenal. As the wider regional conflict expanded, spilling into shipping lanes near the Strait of Hormuz and reaching all the way to strikes on nuclear-related facilities at Fordow and Natanz, one weapon quietly stepped into the spotlight for the very first time. A 5,000-pound precision-guided bomb known as the GBU-72. Senior defense officials, including comments attributed to Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, confirmed this was the weapon's combat debut, and it was not designed to simply flatten something sitting on the surface. It was designed to do something far more dangerous for anything hidden underground. It was built to punch straight through layer. After a layer of rock and reinforced concrete hold itself together through that brutal, violent descent without breaking apart too early, and only detonate once it reaches open space deep inside where the real target is actually sitting. If you're starting to see just how much planning goes into a single strike like this, I'd imagine how much more is still ahead in this video. Drop a quick comment right now telling me one word: mountain, if this kind of detail is exactly what keeps you watching. It helps this video reach more people who actually care about understanding these events, instead of just scrolling past them. Officials confirmed the weapon was first used against Iranian underground sites, storing coastal defense cruise missiles near the Strait of Hormuz. From there, according to open-source military analysts tracking the wider campaign, the same weapon, or something functionally identical to it, was used against the much larger underground missile complex believed to sit in Iran's interior near Isfahan. That is the strike everyone is talking about now because the footage that came out of it does not look like a normal bombing run at all. It looks like the mountain itself caught fire from the inside. Watch that footage closely and a pattern becomes obvious. First, there's the impact itself. Sharp, contained, almost quiet compared to what follows. Then, in the minutes after, secondary explosions begin tearing through the rock in waves, each one bigger and more violent than the one before it. That sequence tells you something very specific. Those later explosions are not the bomb continuing to go off. That's what happens when a weapon reaches a chamber packed with stored missiles, fuel, and warheads, and sets off a chain reaction that the mountain's own structure can no longer hold back. Every blast after the first one is Iran's own stockpile detonating from the inside out. There's a detail here that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, but that analysts who study these underground facilities find genuinely fascinating. How do you actually tell a real tunnel entrance apart from a fake one before you commit an expensive weapon to it? It is almost never decided from a single satellite photo. It comes from watching patterns build over months and sometimes years. Vehicle traffic near a specific entrance, subtle disturbances in the soil from ventilation shafts venting heat and exhaust, thermal signatures that spike at irregular times, consistent with real machinery running deep inside rather than an empty shell built purely to deceive. A genuine underground missile facility produces its own quiet signature: heat, power draw, movement, even when the facility itself is never actually visible from above. Decoys tend to stay strangely still over time because there's truly nothing happening inside them to create that same living pattern. That kind of patient, unglamorous intelligence work, built up slowly over years, is a huge part of why this particular strike landed where it actually mattered, instead of just cratering an empty stretch of mountain. Now let's talk about why this specific weapon broke the calculation Iran spent 40 years building. Every weapon that strikes something dense slows down the moment it hits. The denser the material, the faster it decelerates and the less distance it can travel before either stopping short or exploding too early. Iranian defense planners understood this principle extremely well. For years, they calculated exactly how deep their storage chambers needed to be to sit safely beyond the reach of older American bunker-busting weapons, like the GBU-28. Build past that depth, and in theory, nothing above ground could ever touch you. Older penetrating weapons ran into two consistent problems trying to beat that kind of calculation. The first was simple depth. A bomb that runs out of penetrating force before reaching its target just carves a crater into solid rock and stops there, leaving whatever is buried beneath it completely untouched. The second problem is something most people never even think about. The weapon itself has to physically survive that violent journey downward. Slamming into concrete and stone at extreme speed puts enormous stress on a bomb's outer casing. Older designs sometimes shattered partway through the penetration, or detonated too early, wasting their entire payload on empty tunnel space instead of the actual target buried deeper down. The GBU-70U was built specifically to solve both of those problems at once. Its casing is made from a hardened alloy engineered to survive the kind of violent deceleration that would tear apart older bunker busters. And its fuse is built with a deliberate delay. It does not trigger on first impact. It does not go off a few feet into the rock. It counts, sensing its way through layer after layer of stone and concrete, waiting until its internal sensors detect it has finally broken through into open space, exactly the kind of chamber where missiles, fuel, and warheads would actually be stored. Only then does the 5,000-pound warhead detonate. That single engineering decision is the entire difference between simply scarring the outside of a mountain and destroying what is hidden deep inside it. If you have ever wondered why some military technology takes decades to develop, this is exactly why. Every part of that decision, the alloy, the fuse timing, the sensors, took years of testing and failure before it worked reliably. Speaking of staying with things until they pay off, if you have made it this far into the video, do me a favor and tap the like button now. It genuinely helps this channel keep making deeper, more detailed videos like this one, instead of shallow, rushed content that skips the parts that actually matter. There's a second factor that matters almost as much as the bomb's design itself, and that is speed. Some of the heaviest bunker-busting weapons in the American arsenal, like the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator, can only be carried by the B-2 stealth bomber, which often has to launch from bases as far away as Missouri or from the remote island of Diego Garcia. That kind of mission takes many hours in the air and days of advanced planning before it can even happen. The GBU-72 does not require any of that. It is light enough to be carried by an F-15E Strike Eagle already stationed in the region, which means a jet sitting on a nearby runway can be loaded in the air and over a target in well under an hour once the order is given. That kind of speed changes what is actually possible on the battlefield. It means American forces are no longer limited to hitting targets that were planned weeks in advance. They can respond in near real time to fresh intelligence about where missile stockpiles are actually being moved or stored right now, today. The GBU-72's guidance system adds one more layer of toughness on top of that speed. It can navigate to fixed coordinates entirely on its own, but it can also accept updated targeting information during its final approach. If a pilot has to suddenly break off to avoid a surface-to-air missile, the bomb does not simply drift off course and miss its mark. It locks onto the last confirmed location and continues toward it regardless. In an environment where Iranian air defenses have been weakened but not fully eliminated, that kind of resilience matters enormously for the pilots flying these missions. It also helps to understand where this weapon fits into a much longer history. Bunker-busting munitions are not new. The idea goes all the way back to the Gulf War era, when engineers first modified existing artillery barrels into rough but effective penetrating bomb casings, after watching earlier weapons completely fail to reach buried Iraqi command bunkers. Every generation since has chased the same basic goal: more penetration, more reliability, less wasted payload, refined slowly through decades of trial, failure, and hard battlefield lessons. The GBU-28 that Iran's engineers spent years designing their defenses around was itself considered cutting edge when it first entered service, a massive leap forward compared to anything before it. But weapons technology does not simply freeze in place just because an enemy finishes calculating its defenses around one specific threshold. The GBU-72 is the next link in that long chain, built using years of penetrator testing, improvements in metallurgy, and a far more advanced understanding of exactly how rock and reinforced concrete behave under extreme, sudden stress. Iran was not defending against a fixed, unchanging threat. It was defending against a moving target that kept quietly improving, while its own defensive depth stayed exactly the same. Put all of that together: a weapon engineered to survive violent penetration, a fuse timed to detonate at exactly the right depth, a jet already stationed in the region capable of delivering it within the hour. And you start to understand why officials and independent analysts alike are calling this strike a genuine turning point, not just another bombing run inside a much longer conflict. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because not everyone agrees on exactly how much damage was actually done. Several open-source military analysts who reviewed satellite images taken after the strikes on Iran's underground facilities near Hormuz and Isfahan gave a noticeably more careful read than the first wave of headlines suggested. According to their analysis, the strikes appear to have severely damaged tunnel entrances, surface support buildings, and visible equipment sitting above ground. But the deepest vertical launch shafts, arguably the actual heart of the complex, show no confirmed direct hits. In other words, this strike may have sealed the mountain rather than fully destroying everything sheltered inside it. That distinction matters more than it might sound at first. Sealing an entrance can still stop missiles from being wheeled out for launch for weeks or even months. It can trap transport vehicles deep inside the tunnel network with nowhere to go. It can knock out the surface logistics Iran would actually need to move anything from that facility toward a launch position. Even a strike that falls short of total destruction can still impose a very real operational cost, just a different kind of cost than the dramatic footage might suggest at first glance. If you're enjoying the way this story keeps peeling back layer after layer, that is exactly the kind of storytelling this channel is built around. Subscribe now if you have not already, and turn on notifications, because this conflict is far from finished, and there's a lot more coming. That gap between perception and reality matters for a very specific reason. Iran's ballistic missile stockpile is not just a weapons cache sitting in storage somewhere. It is the connective tissue holding together almost every other piece of the country's strategic position in the region. Without a credible missile threat, nearly everything else Iran relies on to project power loses much of its weight. This is not sentimental attachment to old hardware sitting in a warehouse. The missile program is functionally load-bearing for Iran's entire strategy, the way a support beam holds up an entire building even though nobody notices it until it starts to crack. And here's something that stays consistent through this entire conflict, something that might actually be the single most important thing to understand if you want to know why ceasefires and negotiations keep collapsing before they can ever really take hold. Iran's government does not speak with one voice. In practice, it behaves like two separate centers of power that frequently do not agree with each other. On one side sits the political and diplomatic leadership, the foreign ministry, parliamentary negotiators, and whatever remains of the inner circle around Iran's supreme leader. Their priorities tend to center around regaining international legitimacy, securing relief from crippling sanctions, and avoiding a full military collapse of the regime's structure. On the other side sits the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which controls the bulk of Iran's missile program, its drone fleet, and its network of regional proxy forces. Their institutional interest runs in a completely different direction. Protect the leverage that missiles and drones provide, and resist any agreement that would meaningfully shrink that power, because that power is exactly what makes the IRGC matter inside Iran's own domestic political system. Throughout this conflict, a strange and almost contradictory pattern keeps showing up again and again. Political officials signal openness to a deal, sometimes even claiming one has already been reached. At the very same moment, IRGC-linked forces continue their operations, occasionally escalating instead of pulling back. This has happened repeatedly during this campaign, including reports of attacks on shipping traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, occurring at almost the exact same time that diplomatic statements were suggesting real progress toward negotiations. This is not necessarily confusion, and it is not simple bureaucratic incompetence. It may be something more structural than that. Two institutions, inside the same government, operating under completely different mandates, making different decisions, sometimes without any meaningful coordination between them at all. That creates a serious problem for anyone trying to negotiate with Iran in good faith, because a political commitment made in Tehran does not automatically bind the military commanders who actually control missile launches and drone operations on the ground. This is part of why, even after a strike as significant as the one near Isfahan, and even after reports suggesting movement toward a possible agreement, nobody closely watching this conflict is treating any deal as final until it is actually implemented and held for a meaningful stretch of time. The pattern has repeated itself over and over throughout this war. Announcement, continued operations, denial, another announcement. Until actions on the ground actually match the words being said in press briefings, skepticism remains the responsible default. Meanwhile, the wider regional picture has not calmed down either. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most economically important oil shipping corridors on the entire planet, has repeatedly been declared closed by Iranian naval forces over the course of this conflict, even as hundreds of commercial vessels continue moving through the waterway under American naval escort. That gap between declaration and reality tells you a great deal about where actual control of the strait currently sits, and it also explains exactly why Iran's missile stockpile matters so much to its ability to make that kind of threat sound credible going forward. The ripple effects of that credibility question show up far from the battlefield, in places most people would never immediately connect to a strike on a mountain deep inside Iran's interior. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. And every single time Iranian officials so much as hint at closing it, energy markets react within hours. Shipping insurers adjust premiums for tankers moving through the region. Gulf producers quietly reroute cargo through alternative pipelines wherever possible. Traders sitting in London, New York, and Singapore price in a risk premium that has almost nothing to do with actual oil supply and everything to do with how plausible it seems that Iran will actually follow through on its threats. A degraded missile and drone arsenal, even one that is only partially degraded, changes that entire calculation. It is one of the quieter, but far more immediate, ways this strike reaches ordinary people who will never once watch footage of a mountain exploding, but who might still notice the price at the pump shift because of it. This conflict has also revealed something much bigger about where military technology as a whole is heading, and it is worth pausing on before we move toward the end of this story. Alongside these bunker-buster strikes, this war has effectively become a live testing ground for a new generation of low-cost, AI-assisted weapon systems. Cheap precision drones costing a tiny fraction of the missiles they are being used to intercept or destroy. Autonomous naval systems operating in real combat conditions for the very first time. Coordination software, linking multiple unmanned platforms together with crewed aircraft in ways that were purely theoretical just a few short years ago. None of this is experimental anymore. It is being actively used, tested, and refined in real time in an actual shooting war happening right now. That shift matters well beyond this single conflict. It signals a much broader change in how future wars might actually be fought. And where expensive, precisely engineered, older generation weapons on one side increasingly face off against swarms of cheap, smart, expendable systems on the other. Iran is not just fighting a war right now. It is watching in real time exactly what a future built around this kind of technology looks like. And so is every other country paying close attention to how this campaign continues to unfold. If this kind of bigger picture thinking is something you value, This channel exists exactly for moments like this one. Share this video with someone who actually wants to understand what is happening in the world right now, instead of just reading a headline and moving on. It genuinely helps more than you might think. The reaction across the wider region has been just as telling as the strike itself. Gulf states that have spent years quietly balancing their relationship with Iran, careful never to fully align with Washington or fully break away from Tehran, are now recalculating what real deterrence actually looks like in practice. Some have reportedly moved to strengthen coordination with American air defense assets already stationed on their territory, a shift that would have seemed unlikely just a few years earlier. Israeli defense officials, who have spent years publicly warning about exactly this kind of underground missile infrastructure, have treated the strike as a form of validation for assessments they have been making for the better part of a decade. And across Iranian state media, the messaging has been notably split, official statements downplaying the damage, even as unverified footage keeps circulating and spreading anyway. That tells a very different story underneath the surface. A government trying to control a narrative that its own population is already watching unfold in real time on their phones. So where does all of this actually leave us? The strike near Isfahan did not erase Iran's missile program. Based on the most careful analysis currently available, it likely damaged entrances, surface infrastructure, and visible equipment more severely than it destroyed the deepest, most protected launch capability buried far below ground. But it accomplished something else, something arguably more important in the long run. It proved, publicly and undeniably, that the core assumption Iran built its entire underground strategy around, the belief that depth alone guarantees safety, is no longer something Iran can fully rely on. For 40 years, Iranian military planners studied American weapons capabilities, calculated exactly how deep was deep enough, and built accordingly. That calculation was based on the tools the United States had available at the time. The GBU-72 represents a new answer to an old question, and it forces Iran's leadership to confront an uncomfortable follow-up question of its own. If this weapon reached this particular mountain, what other mountains, built to those exact same specifications, are just as exposed right now, at this very moment? That uncertainty alone reshapes the entire strategic picture. Even without another single bomb being dropped, every future decision Iran's leadership makes about its missile program now has to account for the real possibility that depth is no longer the guarantee it used to represent. That kind of doubt is quiet, but it is powerful. It will not show up in a headline the way footage of a mountain erupting from the inside does, but it lingers in every planning meeting, every construction decision, every calculation about where to hide the next generation of weapons. There are really only a handful of ways this trajectory plays out from here, and it is worth walking through them briefly before we close this video out. One path is continued targeted strikes against remaining underground sites as intelligence identifies them, a slow, grinding campaign rather than one single decisive blow, gradually wearing down Iran's stored capability faster than it can be rebuilt or relocated. A second path is some form of negotiated freeze, likely brokered under enormous international pressure, where Iran agrees to limit further underground expansion in exchange for sanctions relief, even though history strongly suggests the IRGC's actual cooperation with any such freeze would remain uncertain at best. A third, less discussed possibility is that Iran doubles down entirely, accelerating construction of new sites built even deeper and further away from predictable strikes. Corridors, essentially betting that the next generation of concealment can outpace the next generation of penetrating weapons. The exact same bet that just failed near Isfahan, made again with slightly different numbers on paper. None of these paths are mutually exclusive from one another, and given how divided Iran's own leadership currently is, it is entirely possible that different factions pursue more than one of these paths at the exact same time, which would only deepen the kind of internal contradiction we have already watched play out in public statements throughout this entire conflict. Wars like this one rarely end with a single dramatic strike. No matter how much a mountain exploding on camera might suggest otherwise, they end, when they end at all, through a slow, uneven mix of sustained military pressure, economic exhaustion, and internal political struggle, exactly the kind we have watched play out between Iran's political leadership and its military commanders throughout this entire conflict. What the Isfahan strike really did was tilt part of that internal balance. It raised the cost of Iran continuing to rely on underground storage as its primary line of defense at a moment when its own leadership is already deeply divided over what comes next. Whether that pressure is ultimately enough to produce a lasting agreement, or whether it simply becomes one more chapter in a long, unresolved standoff, is still being written in real time right now as you watch this. But one thing has already changed for good. A mountain that was supposed to be untouchable answered back on the night it was finally tested. And after this strike, nobody, not Iran's engineers, not its military commanders, not the people currently deciding what to build next, will ever be able to look at a mountain the same way again. If this video helped you actually understand what is happening in this conflict, instead of just watching another headline scroll past on your screen, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, leave a comment telling me what you think happens next, and I will see you in the next one.